Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the third annual Perspectives Conference entitled Finding a Sense of Place in History. My name is Anthony Sales Hernández, and I will be the moderator tonight. I am one of the editor-in-chiefs alongside Karina Gutierrez and Peter Wassel for this year's volume of Perspectives, a journal of historical inquiry. Perspectives is a student-produced history journal at Cal State LA, which will be showcasing its 51st edition this year. Before we get started with our presentations, I would like to thank the many people who have made tonight's event possible. These include the Perspectives Conference team, Jared Ryan, Felix McDonald, Kenneth Liu, Albert Foz, and our faculty advisor, Dr. Flager. All of these people have played a role in making this conference possible. It has been an enriching experience working with the conference team and so rewarding to see it all come together tonight. And last but not least, I would like to thank our presenters for investing their time and hard work into their presentations to teach us about the findings of their research. I would like to give a brief outline regarding the structure of tonight's online event. Our three presenters will present their research, and then we will have time for questions and comments from the audience. We please ask that you keep yourself muted until the Q&A portion, and if you do have any questions, you raise your hand during the Q&A portion or type your questions in the chat. Thank you in advance for your participation. And with that being said, let us begin. Our first presenter is Haley Castello. Haley Castello is a proud commuter, transfer, and first-generation college student who will receive her BA in history with a minor in Chicano and Latino studies at Cal State LA this spring. She's in her last year of the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship, where she utilizes her interdisciplinary skills and intersectionality to pursue research for a project in the city of Baldwin Park in the San Gabriel Valley. Drawing on her experiences with displacement and eviction, she critiques modernity, capitalism, and colonialism in the suburbs, while centering ethnic community healing and resistance. Her research explores ordinary residents' conversations, attitudes, and emotions from the 19th century onward, through close reading of archival material to dissect contemporary gentrification. Haley has experience in union leadership, grassroots organizing, and teaching. She plans to become a community college professor, hoping to disrupt traditional academic standards and incorporate decolonial wellness into her teaching. She will now present Micronesian Agency versus Colonial Constructs. Take it away, Haley.
Thank you. All right. All right, so thank you everybody for tuning in. As I begin with my introduction, I invite you all to take a look at this cover page to the left as I speak. I will be discussing my research on Micronesian agency versus colonialism, which was a project I worked on in spring 2023 for one of my undergraduate research courses. So, a brief origin story of my project entails looking through a 1967 published National Geographic magazine, which caught my eye because of the beautiful imagery of the girl in the front cover, which you saw on my previous slide. As I reached the end of the Micronesian article in the magazine, I stumbled upon these two pages where the article ends with a former Peace Corpsman embraced by Micronesian polio victims, then followed by a Pan American advertisement that invites the white Anglo-American audience to venture into a Caribbean paradise. Let me share with you my argument that emerged from these two pages and through my research. This microhistory juxtaposes the United States' perception of the world as its American playground via Pan American Airlines with Micronesians' assertion of regional and cultural agency, underscoring the world's inherent regional resistance to such hegemonic narratives, advocating for the challenge and potential defeat of colonial powers while safeguarding indigenous identity, tradition, and selectively integrating assimilated cultures. Heavy and long argument, I know. So let's first put a few pieces together, starting with what and where is Micronesia? Today, Micronesia is part of the Federated States of Micronesia, which encompasses more than 2,000 islands. The Micronesian population is about 500,000, and geographically it lies between the Philippines and Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean. The indigenous islanders share cultural traits, yet each speak their own language and possess their own unique customs, identities, arts, and histories. And here are two of my first introductions of Micronesia from the maps in the 1967 National Geographic magazine that I worked with, depicting the region, which entails a lot of absences of the people and communities already here. I do want to emphasize that this presentation is aimed at centering and uplifting Micronesian voices. So this part of my research will be quickly presented to share with you all how I came to some of my conclusions. So I worked with two American processes, the United States military and Pan American Airlines. So first, for historical context, Micronesia was previously colonized by Japan during World War II, and the United States then intervenes as a liberator conqueror, as described by historian Frank King in the late 1940s. Then we have historian Jennifer Van Vleck, who describes the American airplane as an empire of the air due to military arsenal placed in its regions of travel, such as airports, factories, communication facilities. My research converses with not only US scholars, but Islander scholars as well. So this was a very quick overview of these two American subjects. Now, a quick analysis of Micronesian responses toward US colonialism can be seen here in the images displayed, which come from the National Geographic magazine. Assimilation of Micronesian culture to its latter have always been on their own terms. You see here that some American or modern commodities are played with, like to the left, a pencil in his ear and keys hanging on his traditional too, and the students to the right dressed traditionally in class. These are acts of cultural resistance with hints of adaptation on their own terms. So nearly 2 decades after this magazine is published, the Micronesian community across the many islands created a constitution and in 1986 gained its independence from the United States, making this one of the youngest countries of the time. Granted by the United Nations their sovereignty, they were under temporary agreements with the US to receive funding, which granted the US to still access the territories for its military purposes. And to the audience, don't forget this detail, temporary, because I will share an update at the end of this presentation because the agreement was revisited a few months ago in 2023. So the heart of my project are the Micronesian voices, which I explored through student papers from the College of Micronesia, Facebook groups, poetry, and island scholars. As the Federated States of Micronesia are navigating, governing their islands as a sovereign state, I looked into what the younger generation think about their identity and history, and I also read island scholarship and indigenous Micronesian literature, which I will honor in the rest of this presentation. From the College of Micronesia, student author Priscilla Sapa's personal philosophy paper discusses cultural extinction with concluding calls to action to preserve Micronesian culture. Sapa describes the change over time in Chuk's traditional culture in 5 ways, 3 of them being that food no longer is caught by fishing, clothing has adapted to Western culture, and housing is preferred in concrete structures over traditional huts. Sapa acknowledges that times have changed, and she welcomes the shift into Western culture through cultural resistance in some aspects of her life. Her calls to action are to take ownership of the choices being made in daily practices, for the government to incorporate cultural education best suited for the history, language, and culture of Micronesians, and for the community to revive a local production of food. Next, scholar Gonzaga Buas. Buas grew up on a Micronesian island in the state of Chuuk. His work is paving the way for more Micronesian perspectives to enter academia with first-hand accounts from native islanders, with primary documents like his own passport under the United States, which is something I discussed in my paper. Boas argues that Micronesians have been dealing successfully with the outside world since the colonization period, reclaiming their efforts in navigating colonial powers in their islands, which is shadowed by Western narratives that victimize Micronesians as though they haven't had their own agency within this history. And he shares the local and cultural resistance that Micronesians participated in throughout these colonial periods in his book, which is shown on the slide here if you wanted to take a screenshot. Finally, through a book launch of a Micronesian anthology of indigenous literatures that I found on a Facebook group, I had the honor to delve into a collection of writings and poetry that made me feel pain, made me feel love and encouragement, and it's sectioned into themes of origins, resistance, remembering, identities, voyages, family, and a new Micronesia. The remainder of this presentation, I will read two pieces of literature from the book. The first are a few excerpts from My Island is One Big American Footnote from the theme Resistance. And I thought our history community would appreciate the creative use of a footnote. And since we all know what they are, here goes. Footnotes, small islands of text, really, off the margins. Somewhere between margins of national importance, we sit there, ideologically spaces, almost erased, like far-flung chickpeas, etched, embossed on these pages, a strategic seize by a constitutional, conscious, and colonial disease, colonial dis-ease. Alas, we are nothing but footnotes, barely quotes. We are the crap between America's political toes that no one knows or care about. Release us to flutter beyond these American borders and margins. Leave us to determine self fully, a text of our own. Because if the book whose constitution is supposed to be built upon freedom, liberty, democracy won't liberate, elevate, or equal its own footnotes, then who will? By Michael Lujan. Next are some excerpts from Thieves by Anne Perez Hattori under the theme Remembering. Thieves, they called us. Religious converts, they made us. Said we were sinful, naked, savage, primitive, playmates of Satan. Exterminated, they called us. Half-castes, they branded us. Said we were impure, racially, culturally, spiritually. Said we were immature, uneducated, undeveloped, uncivilized, victims of illiteracy. Now they tell us we are simply, sadly, contemptibly overdeveloped, over-modernized, over-theologized, over-Americanized, under-Chamaricized. Chamaricized references the indigenous Chamorro people who are the original islanders of the Mariana Islands. There are many more pieces of literature in this collection, but for the sake of time, I chose to present these few excerpts. Now, to conclude this presentation, I have a brief update. So the Compact's of Free Association Agreement with the US has been renewed for another 20 years, but China has a growing interest in replacing the United States' role since it seems that the US is lacking the funding to continue the agreement with the Federated States of Micronesia and other regions of the Pacific. The funding is looking at a $7.1 billion package for the region, but there is currently no agreement on the offsets in Congress. I'd like to share some final thoughts. Thank you, Perspectives and Phi Alpha Theta, for having me speak today, and use this space to center the Micronesian voices I explored in my research. As a displaced student navigating evictions across generations from Mexico to LA and the suburbs, I'm drawn to grassroots histories that are overshadowed by elite narratives. And this research project pushed me out of my comfort zone, yet I'm grateful for the journey, finding inspiration in Micronesian resilience. Their agency kept me afloat during the semester I wrote this. And I do hope that this presentation sheds light on Micronesian voices and ongoing conversations about sovereignty amidst looming colonial powers. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Haley. Please refrain from asking any questions. We will be doing that at the end of the conference. Our next presenter is Kieran Black. Kieran is a first-year graduate student of history at Cal State LA, having recently attained his BA magna cum laude. His interests lie in utilizing information from disciplines spanning ecology, agronomy, demography, and technology to connect science and history. Kieran's latest work on 20th century Mexico points to the profound interplay between these subjects. He would like to thank Dr. Flager and all the students at Perspectives for helping him achieve his academic goals. Kieran will now present Petrochemical Mexico and Youthful Resistance, 1940 to 1985. Take it away, Kieran.
All right, one moment, please, so I can share my screen. Thanks, Anthony, for the introduction, and thanks for everyone who facilitated this conversation. All right, so I will be hopefully shedding some light on 20th century Mexican history and the relationships between agriculture and politics that I believe defined the mid to late 20th century. So in order to understand the historical background, we have to look at the Green Revolution, or the Third Agricultural Revolution, which was a series of technological innovations in the 1940s and 50s. Most importantly, there were mass irrigation, genetically modified organisms, and petrochemical fertilizers. The last is most important because it enabled the mass irrigation to actually produce in larger crops that the genetically modified organisms were supposed to be. The key players in the Third Agricultural Revolution were the federal governments in Mexico City and Washington, D.C., as well as several transnational organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Bank. The Rockefeller Foundation was especially important for hiring a team of scientists, geneticists, geologists to create the research team that would lead to these innovations. They were led by geneticist Norman Borlaug, who was head of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. So while these events are often talked about for their profound environmental, demographic, and economic consequences, I'd like to push the line of scholarship into the socio-political realm. And to do that, I'm going to take us through a series of historical developments. So the first relevant development was the post-World War II political economy developing in North America. The United States was the only major military power to survive World War II, meaning that they could create the following political economic zeitgeist in their vision, largely. Perhaps the country most impacted by this was their southern neighbor, Mexico. Important for our program, for our purposes, was a program initiated in June 1950 by Harry Truman, who justified venturing into the global South with white supremacist rhetoric about such people being backwards or quote unquote primitive, etc. So this new political economy would rapidly change the relationships between the land, the workers, outside forces, etc. Most important was the disruption of indigenous agriculture. In this new globalized market with massive scale, massive monocultural farms, there was no longer any way for small indigenous farms to compete in the market. Combined with the environmental degradation that we'll go into, this forced a rapid decline of indigenous agricultural methods. So with this land, with these people pushed out of their land, we would see massive amounts of environmental degradation. This is due to unsustainable practices like mass irrigation or the application of too much exogenous chemicals. This led to every form of degradation you can imagine, from desertification to deforestation to the depletion of soil nutrients and disruptions of local microbiomes. Most importantly is that a positive feedback loop set in wherein the environment got worse, driving the people out who had the necessary knowledge to improve it, which thus made the environment worse, driving out the people with the incentive and knowledge to improve it. Play that over a couple decades. And you see an unprecedented wave of urbanization during this time. I have a visual aid from a book by Herman Vergara, published by Cambridge U in 2021. We can see how, as a percentage, the single largest increase in the modern history of Mexico City took place during 1940 and 1950, when these technologies were being made. And that's largely due to the rural migration that was taking place. Pardon me. So between 1940 to 1960, over 2 million rural migrants arrived to urban centers. Also important, of course, was the rapid increase in calories that were available at the time. So here we have population pyramids taken by the Mexican census of 1940 and 1970, respectively. And the really important things to look at are the more top-heavy and choppier left pyramid versus the much smoother and bottom-heavy right pyramid. This implies a period of constant and stable population growth, which of course necessarily makes for a youthful society. So then on to the 1950s into the 60s, we can see the plight of children starting to become documented by popular culture. Here I have a still frame from the movie Los Olvidados, or The Young and the Damned in English, which very aptly portrays this new generation of children who are trapped in unsafe urban environments, often at the mercy of industrialist interests. So we can see how through these historical developments, the 1960s were primed for youth discontent because the urban infrastructure was not sufficiently able to accommodate all of the both natural and migratory growth. So I didn't come to this conclusion about the relationship between the Green Revolution and youth rebellion in Mexico by myself. Here are some of the most important books that led me to this conclusion. Herman Vergara's Fueling Mexico, Energy and Environment, 1850 to 1950, was very important for introducing this line of thinking to me. And my research largely tried to extend that timeline and build off of the relationships they were talking about. Also, we have a book by one of our own professors, Dr. Ford, Childhood and Modernity in Cold War Mexico City. While I did not personally take one of her classes, it was recommended to me by another one of our Mexican history experts, Dr. Ochoa. So I have had a lot of great professors to learn from. Next, we have Troubled Harvest by Joseph Cotter. This is the book on the relationship between agriculture and politics in 20th century Mexico. Next, we have La Construcción Social y Política del Medio Ambiente by José Luis Lezama, which translates to The Social and Political Construction of the Environment. This work was really important because it's largely centered on Mexico City from 1950 to 1980, and it reveals some of the more ideological, social, constructionist aspects of what I was researching. Finally, amazing book on the Green Revolution is Seeds of Sustainability by Pamela Madsen, and it really aptly conveys the relationships that were developing between indigenous communities, their land that they had been tending for centuries, millennia, and the new capitalist global north interests. So there was a new tripartite relationship between these three things. And this book very aptly explains that. So in conclusion, I think this work is relevant for a couple reasons. It hopefully contributes to a growing body of work called socioecology, which examines the relationships between environment, population, and culture, which is a constant stream of any historical inquiry. It also challenges the notions of progress and technology and how, in fact, technological process increases the capability for socioeconomic stratification without intervention. Also, I think it sheds some light on the importance of the Green Revolution generally and how it should be ranked alongside World War II and with World War II as the creation of the modern world. Finally, this sort of work that melds the social and natural sciences, I think will be really important if we ever want to make political policy that adequately addresses some of these issues. So thank you very much for listening. I was very honored to be invited to talk.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Please hold your questions to the end of the conference. Thank you, Kieran. Our final presenter is Steph Wood. Steph is an undergraduate student at CSULA majoring in history who transferred in fall 2023 from LACC with associate degrees in social behavioral sciences and computer science. Originally from Idaho, they moved to LA from Seattle in 2016. They are aspiring to pursue a career within libraries and are interested in history, people, and diverse communities embedded within both. They often read about global queer labor, race movements, art history, and pop culture history. Steph will now present Elagabalus, a queer icon constructed from Damnation Memoria. Take it away, Steph.
Thank you, Anthony. 1 second for me to share my screen. All right. Hello, all. I'm Steph Wood. I'm currently finishing my junior year at CSULA, and I completed this work last fall during my first semester at CSULA after transfer. Elagabalus was a 3rd century. Elagabalus was a 3rd century Roman. I had more to say. I chose to focus my research on the subject of one of my favorite paintings, The Roses of Heliogabalus by Lawrence Amatadima, which has been used throughout the background of my presentation. Heliogabalus was also known as Elagabalus, and throughout my work and during this presentation, I'll refer to them as Elagabalus. Elagabalus was a 3rd century Roman emperor, but the rest of what we know about them is largely from speculation and biased translation over the centuries after their death. There are only 3 surviving contemporary sources that discuss them from their time in the 3rd century, and in these accounts, Elagabalus was requesting to be called a lady, not a lord, and was also publicly asking for research into sexual reassignment surgery to be advanced. Through this speculative history, Elagabalus has also become known in some museums as a trans empress. Because my research emphasized the idea that the evidence that we have for Elagabalus's queerness is exactly the evidence that could support a revisionist narrative of their entire character due to historical resentments and later homophobic and transphobic editing. This editing left Elagabalus's true gender identity indefinitely unknown to us, and for that reason, I have chosen to refer to them using they/them pronouns, and did so in my research as well. I'll be talking about 4 groups along a timeline of larger discussion surrounding this figure. The first group being the leader's ancient contemporaries, the second being the 15th century translators of these contemporary accounts, including the editor of the first translation edition of the Historia Augusta, of which an example is shown on this slide, followed by the artists and scholars of the Victorian era that produced the painting I have highlighted, and closing with present curators and historians, as well as my own contributions to this discussion through my work on this subject. Over the long timeline of discussions about this ruler, we have at the beginning their contemporaries. This ruler suffered from historical damnatio memoriae, which translates roughly to condemnation of the report. This means that the only surviving sources we have are intentionally extremely minimal and mostly written by resentful senators that were indifferent to Elagabalus's violent assassination. This left them very biased and with reason for any reader to remain suspicious about the truthfulness of the claims that they made. The tendency to want to overlay modern ideas about sexuality onto the ancient world is common, but ancient ideas of sexuality were much less clear than the modern ones that we can identify within the present. Ancient sexuality relied much more on social ideas of power, and the position that one held in society determined the role that they were expected to fill sexually. Elagabalus's queerness may not have been incompatible with ancient Roman culture overall, but an emperor that presented as feminine and took on deviant behaviors and sexual roles may have been incompatible with Rome's idea of an emperor specifically at this time. A penetrative sexual role was representative of Roman citizenry in the 3rd century, and a receptive sexual role was considered innately of non-citizens at that time. This meant that all women, slaves, and foreigners were non-citizens in the Roman Empire, and framing Elagabalus, who was a Syrian transplant in this way in particular, may have been a larger strategy to other them as a foreigner out of their place while they were firmly seated in traditional positions of authority as a teenager and after a successful coup achieved with their mother. There are some modern sources that claim that the Roman Empire's ideas of gender were definitively and strictly binary in a way that our present societies would be able to relate to. For example, 18th century scholars wrote that Elagabalus was subverting all accepted laws of nature and decency. But determinations about how queer ancient Rome was are still being debated historically. So comparing a European regard for decency from the 18th century to ancient Roman leaders engaged in diverse behaviors before Abrahamic religious dominance can and has led to misguided perceptions through time. The next in this historical conversation were 15th century translators, whose distaste and misunderstanding of Elagabalus was spread through the condition that they left the surviving sources available to us in. Bonus Accursius was the original 15th century editor, and he heavily edited the texts he had access to in numerous irreparable and unaccountable ways, along with 2 other 15th century editors who did the same within a few decades of him. The entirety of what was changed we still do not fully know. And we also can't know the true intention behind every syntactical or etymological change made by translators like Accursius. What we do know about him is that he was living in Milan, and many of his projects were fantasy or biblical translations intended for beginners who were self-learning languages. We also know that editors generally had different ideas about their role and the intended purpose of their work in the 15th century than we would have today. Translations were thought to create and contribute important additional contexts and meanings from an original text, rather than simply being a substitute for it in another language. For this reason, editors and translators saw themselves as kind of co-creators of the original text that they were working on, and especially in cases when their work would be the first translation from that original source. Knowing that their work would be pivotal for future translators, they would correct perceived errors in the original grammar or language to meet their own modern linguistic standards. And preserving the exact originals was not the utmost priority for these translators. So the changes that were made to increase overall readability for their modern consumers weren't thought to damage the original text. Translations were also thought to supersede any other meaning from the exact original text. So the changes that were made by editors were often irreversible. In 1475, Accursius edited the first edition of the ancient Historia Augusta, which is one of the 3 surviving sources that addresses Elagabalus from antiquity. Later scholars believe that the original document was edited, amended, and rearranged to remove references to paganism, both deities and rituals. Keeping this in mind, How much of the contemporary disgust for Elagabalus's rumored queerness actually belonged to the original authors of the work versus how much belonged to the later religious editors of the text is left fully opaque to us today. The next group involved in this ongoing conversation were the Victorian artists and German scholars who studied these works. There was a kind of modern reconstruction of Elagabalus in the 18th and 19th century, even though the personal agency and autonomy required to determine their true identity was irretrievably missing. Their story was being used to enhance our own ideas of queerness, for better or for worse. The painting I favor was released during this period, but interest around Elagabalus was being fueled by public conversations between the scholars who were researching various 15th century translations and then comparing those translations to their references in antiquity. They were finding that what survived of Elagabalus was not only fascinating, but impossible to determine the actual accuracy or tone of in its current state. Scholars released their findings to the public as they worked to determine and confirm their ideas around the narratives left to us, along with the accuracy of it all. With this public discourse ongoing, all at once, artists like Alma Tadema were inspired to paint this painting, and figures like Oscar Wilde were relating to these new narratives about ancient queerness in letters to his friends after he was being charged with indecency for his own sexuality. This timeless relation is pivotal to the queer representation that Elagabalus has come to personify. Elagabalus has been mentioned sporadically in pop culture and in art throughout the last century. They have become an icon for gay authors. And most recently, a museum in Hitchin, United Kingdom, announced that they were changing the gendered pronouns associated with Elagabalus in their exhibits on Roman antiquity to she and her, to show respect for the historical request to be called a lady and not a lord. When asked about the intention behind this change, the museum council member explained his perspective, saying, "We know that Elagabalus identified as a woman and was explicit about which pronouns to use, which shows the pronouns are not a new thing." Yet even this is such a simple and flattened representation of the ancient historic and present discourses surrounding gender and its expansiveness. The emperor is a character fully constructed from the narratives that remain about them, which are very limited because of the damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of the report, that destroyed all records of them otherwise. It leaves nearly all reasonable conclusions about superfluous character details open and possible. At the same time, and for the same reasons, fully cemented conclusions remain indefinitely impossible about them. Gender expression encompasses much more than simple pronouns, and there is little material difference in changing what you call someone without matched effort to examine the true context that they live within. There is a refusal to engage with gender as a deeply personal, fluid, socially and individually constructed, and inconsistently observed and experienced abstract concept that leaves those refusing to engage with that concept waiting in a more shallow analysis of pronouns and aesthetic speculation for the sake of simplicity. Whether it is truly more respectful could also be debated. With more queer voices surviving to successfully contribute to this historical conversation, there is a call to expand our perceptions of gender and to include cultural perspectives and research outside of the current Western standard and strict binary views. The real issue with the historiographical conclusions made about Elagabalus in many instances is the reliance on a polar opposite, entirely non-queer, cis heteronormative identity as an only alternative to possibly hyperbolic rumors about their queerness. This nebulous, modern, socially defined default masculinity must also be further deconstructed if the entirely flamboyant, queer identity that has been constructed for Elagabalus must be. The mystery and surviving interest inherent to the arguments about Elagabalus throughout history are precisely the lack of evidence for either conclusion. Our own historical narrators are still struggling to remain objective, unbiased, and fair in admitting that an entire spectrum of queer realities are just as likely as heteronormative ones in many contested cases. Admitting that the questions we have about Elagabalus and queerness more generally in the present day are not simply answered with yes or no, trans or not, he or she binaries represents the first steps towards fully respecting the nuance and diversity of existence and the right of every human to self-determination, with trust that they and they alone can identify certain aspects of themselves, like gender and sexuality, and accurately at any point in history. I want to thank the Perspectives team and conference for inviting me to speak, and I also want to thank my professor, Dr. Reed, for encouraging me to submit my work. That concludes my presentation, and I'm open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Steph. We will now begin the Q&A portion of tonight's conference. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom function. You can also type your question in the chat. Yeah. Karina.
Yeah, so I have a question for all the presenters. Each one of you guys have a very unique topic, and I'm wondering how you guys came about your topic. Was it something personal? Was it a class, or you just wanted to research more? We can go in the order of the presenters. So Haley can go first, Kieran, and then Steph.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So the origin stories in my presentation, that's where it all started. Our professor, Dr. Endy, he brought up like a bunch of stacks of National Geographic magazines, and as an exercise was like, just search for them, maybe you'll find a microhistory. And then I learned what microhistories are, and like I challenged myself. This is so outside of the realm that I'm comfortable in because I'm a minor in Chicanx and Latinx studies. And so I was really fascinated with these two pages in the magazine that were very juxtaposing with the advertisement and then like Peace Corps man with polio victims. And I was like, oh, this is why would they place this advertisement here? So I was just curious. That's my origin story, and I'm so glad I got to explore overseas through my research and read student papers from the College of Micronesia. And so that's really how it started. It was just an exercise, but it turned into a research paper.
Thank you.
Regarding my work on Mexico, I'm really interested in that topic I mentioned, socioecology, which covers the relationship between environment, population, and culture. And so this seemed like the best place to apply some of those lines of thinking. I had already studied the supposed first two agricultural revolutions of the Near East and early modern Britain. So I ended up here, and then through reading about this time period, it seemed like that connection between Youth Rebellion and the Third Agricultural Revolution hadn't been made yet. So I was really excited to try to make that case.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was introduced in my historiography class with Dr. Ann Reed to our assignment for a research paper, and was presented in class with some queer narratives, but I've always been interested in historical queerness as a queer student, and had this favorite painting as well that I had been introduced to a few years ago, of this trans empress that I was interested in. So being able to explore that topic along with the question in Professor Reed's class of what we all believed history to be, and my answer being salacious gossip, I felt it was appropriate to just explore for the semester, and I'm glad that I was able to.
Thank you so much for answering the question.
Okay, well, I have a question for all the presenters. We'll do the same order as well. I was curious to see if you all had any difficulties in your research process, and if so, how did you get past that obstacle? We'll go in order. Haley, Kieran, and Steph. Thank you.
Yeah, so difficulties and challenges were definitely, so I'm a first generation student. I had just transferred. I've never done such a large research project like this. And so this was my first time really delving as a history major into primary sources and analyzing, reading against the grain, like discovering absences and what they mean. So a lot of challenges were trying to find primary sources from a Micronesian perspective because everything that I was gathering online was through the American perspective. So that's why I worked really closely with Dr. Indy in our class. It was a small class, so I was really happy with. It felt like a cohort of students just doing research. So he had us collaborate a lot, having fresh eyes on my work, having others pose questions like, "I don't understand this. Can you clarify this?" So working as a team really is what helped me with those challenges and navigate because I got so lost in the sauce of like, okay, I know what Micronesia is now and where it's located, but then I forgot like I need to explain to others like where this region is, who's here. So honestly, it was thanks to that small cohort of us doing our research project and the help with our professor.
Thank you.
The biggest difficulty I ran into is definitely the interdisciplinary nature of the work. I had to read about like agrochemicals, like very specific, like natural science things, as I mentioned, the social construction of the environment. I also had to brush up on my Spanish a bit, but 2 years of Latin in high school helped immensely with that. So yes, thank you.
Thanks.
I think that one of the difficulties that I had in my project was probably just the way that it expanded. Like I said, I began with my painting and didn't really have a full direction for where I wanted to go with my project. So ended up researching a lot more than I expected over the semester. And I think like Kieran ended up researching things that were very specific because I would find narratives that were interesting and then I would want to find the historiography around those narratives and build a larger context. So I ended up researching a lot more than I anticipated, but I think that it was valuable work.
Thank you, Steph. Pete.
Thank you, everyone. Those are fantastic presentations. I learned a lot. I have kind of a question for each presenter, and I wonder how best to go about it. I think maybe Haley, I'll ask your question first, and then Kieran, I'll ask yours, and then Steph, I'll ask yours. So start with Haley. Um, I'm interested a lot in, and this is a recent interest of mine, world systems and periphery core kind of ideas, like large global systems. And I wondered, and I know that no one here is an expert on these subjects, so I don't mean to put anyone on the spot. I'm just interested. Was there any information that you came across as far as Micronesia's dependence on food from the outside? Do they import a lot of their food?
Yeah, thank you so much, P. I also made it an effort in my work and my paper to not describe them as third world. Instead, I was using those terms too, like periphery, semi-periphery, core, to really start thinking differently about the global scale. And yeah, they do still rely heavily on outsourcing food. Spam was one of the creations during the World War, and so it did also increase diabetes and heart disease there. So, in a lot of I only chose a few Micronesian voices to uplift today because of time, but I worked with a lot, and a lot of the students that wrote in their papers, in their journals, were discussing the need for more local production of food. They want to definitely take many steps away from outsourcing from the United States. And so through the poetry and the literature um, book that I got to read, they're really calling for like pure sovereignty. But they're just kind of stuck in these agreements that uh, periphery like officials are making. So yeah, thank you for that question. I hope that answered it.
Thanks, Haley. Yeah, that was great. Kieran, my question is, I guess when you're doing your research, did you notice, were there, I feel like the rise of urbanization in this second half of the 20th century obviously is not unique to Mexico. And I wonder, were there other factors that you came across that weren't necessarily agriculture or market based?
Well, a lot of those other cultural factors had already been, it seems like, dissected at length. So I frankly wasn't as interested in pursuing those.
I can understand that. Steph, I think my last question is for you, obviously. You mentioned the Historia Augusta. I am very much on the fringes of any Roman history. I've read some pop Roman history, I think that maybe others have read. But what I've heard of the Historia Augusta is that it's a real touchy source. And I wonder, you mentioned how it was, um, I get it was like written over in the 15th century, right? Or like re edited heavily in the 15th century. Is that the issue with Historia Augusta, or do we know who even wrote it originally?
Thank you for that question. I actually looked into this a lot. So we don't know who wrote it originally. It could be anywhere from one to over a dozen authors. And that's the research that German scholars were doing in the 18th and 19th centuries, were realizing that these narrators were not the same and the things that they were referencing could not be from the same person. So um, it's touchy because of the way that it was edited and translated, but also because of the way that it was constructed originally. And like I said, the original three sources are all from around this time, and the way that they were constructed for this leader specifically was centered around the damnatio memoriae that they were subject to, which was kind of a political situation where all of the records were destroyed other than these specific sources that were approved. So the other sources that are surviving are Dio's Roman history and Herodian of Antioch's Roman history. And then, like you said, Historia Augusta. But the narrators of those stories, we can't really fully nail down. And I think that was what I ran into in my research, was that like we just aren't going to be able to figure it out, unfortunately, at this point. But the mystery is intriguing still.
Thank you so much. That's very cool.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you to the presenters for answering those questions. We have a question in the chat from Dr. Reed. The question is, they're curious to know if the presenters plan on continuing their research in these fields. Will these projects continue to have a life after this presentation? If so, how do you think these projects will evolve? We can go in the order of the presenters. So,
Yeah, I'm I don't plan on continuing this research. It was my first time doing something like this, and it turned out to be something I really fell in love with. So I'm currently working on a new research project. A Mellon Mays Fellow. But it's still rooted in the same type of regional resistance because it's on the San Gabriel Valley, cities Baldwin Park and Irwindale, which are two lesser known cities in the area. So it still holds true to the voices that I'm trying to recover and uplift. But I definitely, now that I've done this research, I'm keeping an eye on like any updates related to the compact agreement with Micronesia and what's happening next. So now it's on my radar. So that's what I have to say for that.
To answer Dr. Reed's question, I'm in talks with Dr. Ochoa, who is himself a specialist in Mexican food and politics. So yes, I am very looking forward to developing this research, perhaps if not into a dissertation, some of the comps projects. Thank you.
I am always interested in continuing research into queer subjects, especially from antiquity and history. So I think that in that sense, I will probably continue this type of research. But as far as Elagabalus is concerned or this subject, other than this conference, which was already more than I expected, and I'm very honored to be a part of, I don't think that I would research them more other than to just admire the artwork about them, honestly.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Steph. I'm gonna survey the chat, see if there's any more questions. Okay, I do have a question for Kieran specifically. So as a fellow Mexican historian myself, I guess my question is more specifically, you talk about this kind of youth movement. Did you include or did you find any? Okay, so essentially, I find the Mexican Revolution has a large impact on, relations between the US and Mexico, even today, from something that happened almost 100 plus years ago. So in your research, did you find the Mexican Revolution playing a role in any of the mass migration as a result of the petrochemicals, or was it something entirely different?
So yeah, definitely the Mexican Revolution sort of sets the stage for the entire century. The way that I sort of interpreted that event in this work is I highlighted it for creating a system that was incapable of fending off these global north capitalist influences following the end of World War II. I think that was ultimately a consequence of the failed centralization.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Keith. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Eric. The question is for Haley. Haley, in your research, did you find or come across any relations to the United States colonization in the Philippines? Oh, there's several questions. Yeah, and then the next question from Eric is, Kieran, have you thought about how the move to urbanization has changed small cities in Mexico? And another question directed at Steph is, Steph, in your research, did you find any similarities to Alexander the Great? We can go in the order that the questions were asked. Please let me know if I need to repeat them.
Thanks. Yeah, did I find or come across any relations to the US colonization in the Philippines? I do recall like glancing over that. It's not something I've focused on, but if the research were to be developed more or expanded, I think that would be a great opportunity for students to or researchers to look into. But I did see a little bit of that, but I didn't have time to expand it more. I really tried to narrow it for the semester.
Thank you, Haley.
To answer the question about urbanization and smaller communities, it seemed like the biggest impact to me was the move from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based economy, because as these people were no longer able to sustain their livelihood with agriculture, if they did want to remain in more rural or suburban communities, they were often forced into these factories that were popping up.
Thank you, Haley.
And then the answer to my question about Alexander the Great, there is some reference to Alexander the Great and those types of figures in my research because I was researching many Roman historical emperors at the time just to figure out what type of narratives were accurate versus inaccurate. But because Alexander is extremely coveted and respected as a leader, they have a lot more information, or he has a lot more information about him that survived. With Elagabalus specifically, they were more compared to other condemned emperors. So some of those emperors' names would be used in place of theirs as well. There were a few examples, but they were all condemned emperors. And so those kinds of condemnation were kind of interchangeable in history, interestingly enough.
Thank you, everyone. We have another question in the chat for Steph. How have you navigated the difference between ancient queerness and modern queerness when writing for a modern audience who may not understand the difference, who may not understand or be familiar with queerness? Thank you, Steph.
I think in those instances, I am very aware of that circumstance, obviously, because the majority of the people that I interact with at school are obviously not queer. But in my research, I think that I address that by researching things like clothing choices and like what those culturally meant at the time to multiple cultures. In my research specifically for Elagabalus, I was researching what a tiara or a diadem would have been significant in their culture, whether it would have been associated with masculinity or femininity, whether their colorful dress or their robes would also be associated with those things. And those things ended up being ambiguous, and I did include that in my research. So I think that just trying to be objective about those things and also kind of keep a bird's eye view above the conversation and try and remove my own parts, my own opinions from it to just present what has been said was helpful. And I think that it also helped to give me context about these things because even as a queer person, I think I'm still learning and I think that we all have room to. So it's just an interesting thing to look at historically, especially when you can recognize the differences and how things evolve over time.
Thank you, Steph, for a very detailed response. We have two questions for Haley. Haley, why do you think that the Micronesians were able to adapt to the New World better than other countries? And then I'll ask the other question after this question.
That's a great question that I actually don't have an answer to. But something curious to think about, and I'll take a picture of that question to think about after this conference.
Thank you, Haley. The next question is, okay, it seemed that from the Thieves poem that Christianity is associated with the negative assumptions leveled towards Micronesian society. What are the Micronesian perspectives towards religion outside their culture, and are they receptive to it?
Ooh, another great question. I didn't focus much on the religious aspect. In the beginning of my research, I did find a lot of U.S. missionary work with discussing Micronesia and the Micronesian communities, which uh, were just written with a lot of ideologies. And so I stuttered away from that, just because religion's a whole nother aspect, with the missionaries there and colonial projects. So I don't really have an answer for that, but thank you for asking. Again, these are really great questions that I think if I were to develop the project or if this does reach someone who is watching this on YouTube in the future, like they could definitely look into the many multifaceted layers of this research.
Thank you, Haley. I'm going to scan the chat for more questions. Karina?
So I have a question for Steph. In your presentation, you mentioned like that you focus on the subject of your favorite painting. And I'm assuming that the painting was the background of your presentation, and I'm wondering if you could talk more about that painting.
Sure. So Alma Tadema was a male painter, but he was working in a workshop with both his wife and his daughter at the time, which was kind of unexpected and controversial because women weren't really respected in the professional art world usually and weren't allowed in workshops with men. So he was working alongside his family, and his style was described as feminized antiquity, mostly because he wasn't painting battles and he was instead focusing on more everyday life scenes and decadence and luxury. So they associated that with femininity. Also, the painting has a lot of really interesting symbols in it. There's statues that are depicted behind the group in the painting, and the statues are of uh, Ampelos and Bacchus, who were male lovers in Rome, in ancient Rome. So those symbols of queerness are present in the art, and the roses in the front, despite being really beautiful, are actually supposed to be depicting smothering these people to death in luxury. So it is kind of a brutal painting at the same time. Um, I think that that juxtaposition of beauty and fear and kind of violence, especially in relation to queerness, was really interesting to me. So that's what I researched about the painting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. We have another question for Haley. Haley, has Western culture influenced youth identities and aspirations in Micronesian society?
Thank you for that question. Yes, Western culture has, from what I've read, influenced youth identities, even as far as like the there are a lot of Micronesian students that fly out to America. I'm not too sure if it's like a program or something, but in some of these student papers, they stay in the US with some family out here for their studies, but then they end up going back to Micronesia and their islands. It's a lot of homesickness. It's even more love for their islands and wanting to be back in their communities, to invest in these cultural resistances and preservation. So I think in that aspect, Western culture is something they're very aware of in their education system. They learn about US history and they learn about different histories that aren't centered on Micronesian history. So they're very aware of it, and in the youth papers, college papers, poetry that I've read, I'm seeing like a lot of resistance towards it, and some of that acceptance too of like, well, we're here now. Um, we're not doing some traditional things, but we're working with what we got, and yeah.
Thank you, Haley. I'm gonna check for more questions. Don't see any. Karina.
So my question goes to Haley. I know in your presentation you had mentioned that you came across a Facebook page, and I think it's interesting to see how social media can play into research. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that, how you came across it. Go for it.
Yeah, I love that question. So I love social media. I don't actually have a Facebook. I predominantly use Instagram, but I thought I'd check out some Facebook groups. I was just looking up key terms, kind of like you would do on like the library search bar, just like I put like Micronesia, Micronesian communities, and eventually I found this one Facebook page that was dedicated to launching that Indigenous literatures book. And there was like a lot of really cool photos of like the cake that I put in my PowerPoint and like the foods they ate, where they got it from. So I would encourage any scholar doing research to look into Facebook groups for any regional histories that are hard to find in archives, maybe aren't like in the public libraries. So yeah, I went on Facebook. I just was in the search bar and just spend some time just scrolling through and looking at photos, appreciating the culture and what they're posting.
Thank you, Haley. We have a question in the chat for Kieran. Kieran, how did you get into socioecology? What interests you about this topic specifically?
So thanks for asking. It's because after examining the history of many societies and many times, it seemed like the predominating factor on their change over time was demographically rooted in demography. Then demography itself is rooted in agriculture. And then agriculture itself is rooted in the relationship between culture and the environment. So from my perspective, socioecology is a natural field to arrive at when trying to understand history in a macroscopic context. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Kieran, I have another question for you. So in your presentation, you mentioned that there was an increase of youth population and youth discontent. You gave an example of emerging political consciousness with the film Los Olvidados. I'm curious to know if this film received backlash because it highlighted the realities of Mexico at the time.
That's a good question. When the movie was first released in the 1950s, it was definitely scathed. People considered it unflattering, which it certainly is. And that sort of viewpoint held for a while. In the 1960s, however, film criticism was starting to be taken more seriously in the world of academia. And then by the 1970s, people had definitely taken more critical and historical approaches to analyzing Los Olvidados.
Thank you. I was just curious because I had seen snippets of that film in another class. I'm going to scan for some more questions. 1 second. Karina.
So I have a question for all the presenters. Oftentimes when we do research, our research leads us to somewhere else down a rabbit hole. I'm curious to see like where your research has like randomly lead you to. And we'll go in the order of the presenters. So Haley, go ahead and answer.
I want to say, as far as rabbit hole, it was really just understanding, kind of eye-opening the islands in the Pacific and how vast the ocean is. It really freaked me out. Like, wow, like it's so huge. And so I was on like TikTok, just watching videos to really grasp like how large the ocean is and how these islands exist and coexist with nature. So that was my rabbit hole, and now like it's kind of like my Roman Empire. If someone's like, "What's your Roman Empire?" I'm like, "The ocean." The islands. It's pretty fascinating, and in pers like in that video that you saw in my presentation, like it kind of shows you like how many like countries could fit in the ocean and like a whole nother continent. It's like it's huge. That's my rabbit hole.
So because the chronology of my work ends at 1985, perhaps the next really critical development in this story is NAFTA in the early 90s. So if I wanted to bring this work up to the present, I would probably be building off of how NAFTA influenced these relationships I was discussing.
I would say that the directions that I was led in my research were vast. I think that a lot of the meetings that I had with my professor were to try and focus that those rabbit holes towards a thesis. I think it was hard for me to nail down objectively what I thought the topics of queerness and how to analyze it could be. And so I fell down a lot of ancient religious ideologies. I fell down a lot of Syrian fashion from the 3rd century. I fell down a lot of battle and cultural relationships within that entire area and region. And I tried to include little pieces of those things in my paper and eventually got to, I think, a cohesive thesis that I feel proud of at this point.
Thank you, everyone. And with that, that will wrap up our Q&A portion and conclude our conference. Once again, I would like to thank all of the people in attendance for making it to tonight's conference. I would also like to thank our presenters, Haley Castello, Kieran Black, and Steph Wood. And of course, Dr. Flager for providing feedback at every step of this process. And another thank you to my fellow Perspectives team members for your various contributions to tonight's conference. For your information, a recording of this event will be posted on the Cal State LA Perspectives page, and there will also be a link. It will also be posted on the Perspectives Instagram. I'd also just want to say thank you, everyone, for your time. Please take care and have yourselves a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you.